You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian. You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Welcome, all metal fans. This is the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast number 21, and I am excited, man. This is a long-awaited podcast. I've been waiting to do this episode because this is something I hold very dear to me. On this episode, we discuss what I consider one of the greatest movements in rock and roll music, the new wave of British heavy metal. Actually, we've expanded it to the new wave of European heavy metal. And on this episode, I've got probably what I would consider three of the most influential people as far as exposing the new wave of British heavy metal music this side of the Atlantic, and three very old friends of mine. That would be, of course, Metal Blade Records CEO Brian Slagel, Metal Mania founding publisher, editor Ron Quintana, and John Kornarens, who was actually Brian Slagel's original partner with Metal Blade Records on the very first Metal Massacre record. Three very important figures as far as breaking new wave of heavy metal artists here in the United States. The only other person I could think of been more influential would be Lars Ulrich. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get Lars on this episode. But considering the fact that all three of these guys were all very, very close friends of Lars, they happen to throw in some many great Metallica stories within this podcast, which you are about to hear. It was a rather long discussion, well over 2 hours. I tried to edit it down under an hour, but there was just too much good stuff to include, and many other great Lars Ulrich stories the guys tell, which we'll probably have to use on a future podcast because, like I said, we just didn't have enough time to include everything on this episode. But before we get into the festivities, I just got to give a couple plugs here. Of course, this is the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast, heard exclusively at roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. That is our home base. You could also subscribe to the podcast through iTunes and many other podcast directories. Be sure to send in those comments. And if you do want to get in touch with me or any of the players tonight, you could send me an email at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. And for those of you that enjoy this podcast today and you want to hear some of the other episodes that featured our guests today, you feel free to check out our previous Shockwave Skull Sessions episodes. Again, you could go to roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. Some of the episodes in particular that featured our guests tonight, we had the Shockwave Skull Sessions episode 6, the Thin Lizzy special that had Brian Slagel on it, as well as John Sutherland. We also had Ron Quintana on episode number 14, I believe, which was the Golden Gate of Thrash, where we talked about the Bay Area thrash metal bands. Another great episode. And we had a great Metallica episode featuring John Kornarens on my sister podcast, the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast. That was a Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast number 30. That was along with Stefan Shirazi, who is the author of the Metallica, the official Metallica book, So What, and also the editor of the So What magazine from the Metallica fan club. And you want to hear some more great Metallica stories, definitely check that out. Just click on the Shockwaves page and you could get all the episodes. And be sure to check out the current episode, episode number 37 of the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast. That features great interviews I did with Pat Travers and Angel vocalist Frank Domino. Once again, you can check those out at hardradio.com. And before we get into it, another shameless plug for my good friend Bill Hale, who just put out the amazing Metallica photo book called Metallica The Club Days, 1982 to 1984. And for all you hardcore Metallica fans, you are going to absolutely love this book. It is basically a visual history of the band's early club performances in the Bay Area. Many, if not most, of the photos are available for the very first time in public. It is a book, once again, called Metallica, The Club Days, 1982 to 1984. You could order the book through Amazon.com. It should be available as well at your favorite local bookstore. Once again, author Bill Hale took the photos, and I myself was very honored to be involved in this great book. I edited the text for the book, for the photos. So it's a great visual history of the band's early years. I can't emphasize how killer this book is. Just an amazing book. So once again, be sure to check that out. You can get it at Amazon.com or at your favorite local bookstore. If you have a problem finding it, email me here at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. And with that said, man, let's get right into this. A very long, extensive episode and a great one at that. So crack open that beer, do what you got to do, kick back and enjoy. This is the great new wave of British heavy metal discussion. The great new wave of British heavy metal podcast. We've got Ron Quintana, former editor of Metal Mania magazine. Which
could have been actually called Metallica, but that got nixed in the beginning, right?
No, I had so many better names than Metallica.
Ron actually named Metallica.
Now tell me, was that before or after the Encyclopedia Metallica came out?
It was after, because both me and Lars knew about the Encyclopedia Metallica and owned it and referenced it and joked about it and worshipped it. That's probably the true word Metallica origination, which we've both bastardized since then, haven't we?
I think everyone has bastardized it.
Yeah, haven't they?
And of course we got Brian Slagel.
I was just going to say, and we misspelled it on the first Metal Massacre too.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
I love that.
All right, who was responsible for that, John or Brian? Come on, fess
That's
up.
Brian.
No, it was actually the typesetter.
Blame it on the typesetter. Way to go.
They always
Brian,
Ron McGuffey.
No, honestly, it was probably Lars' fault because he got that thing to us so late that we had to scramble around, and I didn't have any time to approve the final version of it, and the typesetter just typeset it that way, and it went straight to the manufacturer. So.
Well, they also Ron McGovney's name was also misspelled, so maybe there was a conspiracy early on.
Funny about that is Ron McGovney didn't even play on the original track, so.
He was credited on Metal Massacre though.
Yeah, but he didn't play it. The original track was just Lars and James. Ron wasn't even. There wasn't even a band at that point. What happened was, Lars was doing nothing, and he and James had rehearsed a couple times, and they hadn't rehearsed in months because there's really no reason to, because they were the only two guys that were into what they're into, and it was really kind of going nowhere. So that's when Lars called me and said, hey, are you putting together this compilation album? I said, sure. He said, if I put together a band, can I be on it? I said, sure. So he went back to James and said, hey, if we record a track, we can actually be on an album now. And that's what kind of got them back together. So the recording that they made was just James played everything but the drums, obviously.
Lloyd Grant.
They had Lloyd Grant come in.
Lloyd only did the lead on it, I think. He just came in and did the lead on
Lloyd
it.
Grant did the lead, and that was James's guitar teacher. That's when, Lars came up with the. Well, I think he was trying to come up with the name before then, but they really weren't even really a band on the very original version of it. And then when we reissued it, we put the better quality version of it, and that one had, all the players and stuff on it. By that point, they had become a band. So.
And that actually had Dave Mustaine on it as well.
There's your trivia. Not that has a whole lot to do with the new wave of British heavy metal, but let's move on.
That track was actually a leather charm track. Pre-Metallica.
Yes.
That's right.
And that intro was from the band Weapon, probably. Set the stage.
Set the stage alight!
So anyway, the voices you hear, of course, Ron Quintana, the originator of Metal Mania magazine, and Brian Slagel and John Kornarens, the two founding members of Metal Blade Records. We're talking about the first Metal Massacre record. When that pretty much started the label. Now, Brian, did that pretty much launch the label from there, or were you just looking to do a compilation record and it just...
I was not looking to run a label at all. I was just, I was doing the fanzine. John and I were doing the fanzine at the time. The new wave of British heavy metal had such a massive influence on me that, I was really, so inspired by the Metal from Others compilations and those other compilations that existed then that, when I saw all these bands, I was working at the record store, I saw all these bands from L.A. that actually were halfway decent. And back then, nobody cared about what was going on in L.A. at all. So I felt the only way to really get somebody to care about it was to put together a compilation album. And I just knew all the distributors because working at the record store, the first thing I did when I started working there was calling all the distributors going, can you get me this band Iron Maiden and Angel Witch and all this other stuff? And they're like, who? So I knew all of them and got, kind of put together the idea. I said, hey, will you guys distribute directly if I make a compilation on that? I said, sure. And that's how that whole thing started. But it was never intended to be a label. It just kind of, one of the distributors knew I had no money because I had no money. And they said, well, seems like you might know what you're doing, so we'll give you a pressing and distribution deal if you want to bring us some more bands. And I was like, sure, why not?
All right. Well, actually, I knew you prior to that. Just to give a little history of how I met all these guys, I met Ron through a letter you wrote in Kerrang when you were working on your fanzine, Metal Mania. And that was right around the same time I met Brian, and I almost sure you were there, John. This was, I believe, pre-Oz Records. Brian, you were selling at the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood. They had a record show there. And I remember coming down with a couple friends, Pat Scott and a few other friends from Huntington Beach.
Pat Scott, wow.
Pat Scott. And we bought, and I remember I was freaking out on the stuff you had, and I had read about, no, this is probably right after, because I believe I first heard about bands like Ocean and Trust and Warning and all those bands from the first issue of Metal Mania. And I saw that you had those records, and I bought the first Ocean and the first Trust record from you, Brian. So there's a little history there.
That's where I actually met John Kornarens at a swap meet as well.
And that's where I picked up the first, actually it was issue 3 with Riot on the cover of the new Heavy Metal Review.
Yep.
And I was blown away. That was like the first U.S. metal fanzine, I believe.
That guy got Ron beat by a couple of months.
Right.
I think you beat me by 1 month.
Was it one whole month?
I put mine out in late August, and yours had just come out.
And I think mine came out a few months after that. The Headbanger came out around the same time. Metal Rendezvous came out also in the Bay Area. And then in the East Coast, there's Kick-Ass Monthly. And yes, it was Brian Slagel.
All about the West Coast, baby. West Coast.
That's right. Anyway, let's get into this. Brian, you first mentioned, of course, the Metal for Mothers record. I remember I got that record when that first came out, and that turned me on to, I believe I knew Iron Maiden before that, but all the other bands that were on it, Angel Witch, EF Band, Samson, that was a pretty much an introduction to me.
That was 1980 EMI, I think. 1980.
Yeah.
Well, sure, all of this stuff, and Ron can, I'm sure, elaborate on this as well as John, but, all of this stuff happened, we're going so far back that, way before the internet. It was all tape trading is where, started hearing about this stuff. And I was a big live concert trader, like when I was in high school in the 70s. And one of my friends who I was trading stuff with in Sweden sent me a live show of, I think it was AC/DC, I can't remember exactly. But at the end of it, he said, hey, here's this band called Iron Maiden that you might also like. Here's a couple songs, check it out. And I heard those songs, and I was like, oh, my God, what is this? And that's when I first started to, write people and go like, hey, what is this about it? And, back then you didn't have the internet or any of this stuff, so you had to basically just, wait for information from people from, and the mail and everything else. And then once things slowly started to happen, you started to get sound. I mean, I think the first time I had heard about it, other than from my tape trading friends, was from Sounds, because you could get Sounds, which was a UK-based magazine back then. They really kind of started the whole thing.
They were the best.
Jeff Barton started the whole thing with the new wave of. He was the one that christened it the new wave of British heavy metal, basically.
Yeah, so the new wave of British heavy metal, because I actually have that issue framed and I'm looking at it. It was December 1st, 1979. And the cover was Thunderstick, and it's called The New Face of British Heavy Metal.
Yeah, Lars put that on the cover of his compilation record.
Yeah.
He did that.
December 1st, 79, and it was about, and he coined it because he had seen a show, I think at the Roundhouse or somewhere in London, but I think it was Angel Witch, Samson, and Iron Maiden. I think at the time Iron Maiden was a 4-piece too, and so was Angel Witch.
Hey John, what was the date on that again?
December 1st, 79. 1st? Yeah.
Wow, so November this year is going to be 30 years. That's crazy.
God damn.
Yeah, that is wow. Yeah, so that's the issue, December 1st, 79, and that's where the phrase got coined by Joe.
Hey, let me throw out a question to you guys because I'm curious to get your opinion on this now. So almost 30 years down the road, looking back, because some of that stuff I think stands the test of time and some of it doesn't. What do you guys now, if you looked at today, if you were to pick like the one band from that whole scene that really was the biggest influence on the history of metal, who would you pick and why?
Let's go
Iron Maiden.
It's got to be Maiden.
Maiden. Kornerans says Maiden. Yeah.
I agree with Maiden. If you're talking about more unknown bands, I would go with Diamond Head, that first Diamond Head album, Lightning to the Nations. I mean, what a monster.
But it only influenced one band, or one drummer.
Well, that's not true.
One dumbass drummer.
You know who probably influenced more bands than any other band from the new wave of British heavy metal? Venom. They started death metal. Without Venom, there would be no death metal. So if you're talking influence, I would say Venom.
I would tend to agree with you, Bob. I mean, look, Iron Maiden is my all-time favorite band. My top 3 all-time favorite records are all Iron Maiden. The first Iron Maiden album completely changed my life, for sure. But I don't know that it had that profound of an impact in the beginning. Like, you look at all the bands that kind of, from all the other countries, they were kind of spawned at that time. I don't know that you would go back and if you look at, let's say, in the 80s, if you talk to all these bands, if they would have immediately said that Maiden was their number one influence. Certainly they were a big part of it, but I think bands like Venom and Diamond Head and even Saxon to a certain degree, at that point had a pretty big influence with a lot of bands that came after that. Now, 30 years later, clearly Maiden is, the dominant band from the scene and the most influential band. Then I almost think that Iron Maiden is influencing more bands from the past 6 or 7 years scenes than they did really in the previous incarnation.
Yeah, it's carried over.
You're right, though. When Maiden came out, I remember Motorhead was the biggest band because they were actually kind of pre-new wave of British heavy metal. Motorhead and Saxon were bigger than Maiden, I remember, when they came out.
And Saxon was a huge influence on so many of those bands, too.
Oh, absolutely, and they got so overlooked. And, that's something I want to get back about later, is about some of the bands that kind of got too Americanized. But Saxon. Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of that, I mean, that was, an interesting thing because you look at the bands that stuck to what they're doing, Motorhead, Maiden, they're the bands that are still around. And you look at Metallica, they just wanted to be like the new wave of British heavy metal bands. They just wanted to be European sounding. But you had, after Def Leppard broke, a lot of these European bands like Saxon, like Diamond Head, like Tigers of Pantang, like Raven, they got American deals. And I don't know if it was more the influence from the record labels or they just kind of wanted to follow the footsteps of Def Leppard.
No, that was absolutely the influence of the record labels. All those bands started out as really awesome underground bands, and they all got signed to major labels who all told them they had to change their sound and do something different. Because this was also, you have to remember that you could go down the list of all the bands that didn't make it, all got signed huge major label deals. And then the scene in America started to switch, where, metal wasn't the big thing anymore, and they needed hits. And, Tigers of Pantang, I think, he's a great example of that.
Absolutely.
Right. Band who I felt was amazing. And the first couple of records were awesome. Then, MC gave them all this pressure. I mean, Diamond Head did the same thing. But they got all this pressure to be commercial and write hit songs, and that just ruined so many of those bands.
Absolutely.
Hey, Bob, Kornerans, let me ask Ron and Brian one question.
What?
Other than Diamond Head, who is the biggest, or what is one of the biggest influences on Metallica musically? Besides Diamond Head, Motorhead. I mean, who else would you guys throw in there?
Misfits.
Who?
Definitely Merciful Fate, for sure.
I think Merciful Fate.
Well, yeah.
No, it's Kornerans. I'm going to throw 2 in, see what you guys think. Number 1, I think James's singing style is absolutely spot on. He got his singing style from Raymond. Was it Raymond?
Raymie Haller?
Yeah,
Haller from
Sweet Savage. Yeah, because if you listen to the way James sang before, and then you hear Killing Time, and you listen to the way Raymond attacks the words and attacks the vocals, I think that's James' singing style. But one other band that nobody ever mentions when they mention Metallica, I'm going to throw out the word Holocaust had a big influence on them. That's my feeling. What do you guys think?
I absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I completely agree with that. What's interesting, though, about both Metallica and Slayer, because Slayer's another band that was hugely influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal. Not as much as Metallica, but clearly a lot. But the interesting thing about those two bands were that they were not only influenced by the European stuff, but they also had a very heavy punk influence. Like James was, when he first met Lars was the European metal dude, and James was way more into the punk stuff. That's why, you see them doing all the Danzig covers and those things. That was the stuff that James was influenced by. And the same thing with Slayer, with, Kerry was the European metal dude, and Jeff Hanneman was the punk dude. It's interesting that both those bands kind of took their sound a little bit from not only the European style, but definitely, the punk overtones too.
Right.
And he also got a factor in Motorhead as a big influence on Lars, which you could say is kind of a bridge between punk and metal.
I think on all the LA thrash bands, or all the U.S. thrash bands, I think Motorhead was clearly the biggest influence. But
judging by T-shirt sales, up in Northern California, you would have thought Tank was the biggest band in the entire world. Everybody had a Tank T-shirt.
Thank you.
But you'd go to England, and everyone in England uniformly hated Tank. I saw them at the Reading Festival. They were the only band to get totally bombed by bottles, cans, everything. Everyone hated Tank in England.
I heard they weren't that good live. I never seen them live, but
they weren't bad.
I mean, that album is just amazing. Filth Hounds of Hades. I think, again, that was an overlooked record. I mean, that really started with the whole metal punk influence. That was, the perfect thrash metal record.
Well, it kind of continues the Motorhead thing.
Yeah, Motorhead had a little bit of the blues vibe, where Tank was just pure on thrash.
Well, you got to remember the whole new wave of British heavy metal scene came from the punk scene. Like, all the influences were punk, and the attitude was from the punk scene. And
I would say more or less Judas Priest and Sabbath. I mean, a lot of people, I think, overcredit the punk scene. Sure, the attitude and maybe the aggression came out of the punk scene, but musically, I don't think the new wave of British heavy metal, like, with the exception of bands like maybe, Motorhead, Tank, and a couple others, had very little to do with punk.
Well, yeah, the early stuff, like if you go all the way back to 79 when this thing really happened, the early bands did, but then you had the kind of second wave, so to speak, which was the Saxon,
more polished.
Yeah, more polished. They were definitely more blues and metal bands. I mean, Quartz, who was one of my favorite.
Led Zeppelin was a big influence on a lot of those.
Absolutely, but
more than punk.
Basically a Sabbath ripoff. I think what's his name produced one of their albums. One of the dudes from Sabbath.
Tony Iommi produced the first Quartz record. Correct. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Tony Iommi did do it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and they actually toured with Sabbath back then, but they were a real underground band. Quartz. They did that record, and wasn't that on MCA or was that a major label? But I don't think it came out in the States.
They had one record on a major label, but like a lot of these bands, I think Holocaust's best moment were their EPs, and Quartz had an EP that had a song on there called Satan's Serenade that to this day is one of the greatest riffs I think I've ever heard. It's awesome. I'm surprised nobody's covered that song.
Well, you actually.
What about Treason by A to Z?
No,
there was all those imports from England that we could never find. We searched all over the West Coast. We'd write to companies in New York, and that's when we got hooked in with like Johnny Z or somebody in New York, trying to find this stuff without having to send weird banknotes to London to try and
Bullet Records, baby, Bullet Records.
This gold, it was like gold.
Believe me, well, John and I went to England just to buy all the stuff that we could possibly.
We went to the Bullet Records warehouse and spent a day.
When did you go?
82.
We went.
We
went
yeah.
To the very end of the whole thing.
Yeah, we were in 82, like April, May 82.
See, that's the best time to go because by then already some other new fad like New Romance or the New Romantics were in. So all the English papers were slagging metal already, and English hype is always a big force in any type of musical genre and rise. There was so much hype on NWOBHM for so long. By 82, it was something new, and so people were getting rid of all that stuff. So you could pick it up pretty cheap in England.
A big part of my time was
Lars went a little earlier than us. He went at the right time, yeah.
Well, actually, Lars went in 81, and that's when he went on tour with Diamond Head, and when he called me from the road and put Sean Harris on the phone, and I just thought, this guy's
whoa.
Oh, yeah.
He did that?
One day, like, it's April or May of 81, and he goes, I want to go to England for a couple weeks. Really? Okay, I just thought you didn't have any money. Well, I'm going to go anyhow.
So we're like,
and then a week later, my phone rings, and it's like Lars calling from somewhere, Newcastle or somewhere, and he says, guess who I'm with? I said, who? I go, well, I'm with Diamond. I said, yeah, right, bullshit. He goes, here, talk to Sean Harris. And he put Sean Harris on the phone. So it's,
no way.
But a lot of what I would do with Lars is we go out and, and I'd end up buying Sounds Magazine, go to Lars's down in Newport Beach, or he'd come up here, but most of the time I'd go there. And you go into the back and you find the Bullet Records ad. Every issue, under heavy metal. And I just remember looking at it with him and, fuck, look at this thing, Holocaust, heavy metal mania. Fuck, it's an EP, 3 songs. We got to buy it. So, come up with some crazy banknote like Ron says, and then you got to send it off. And then a month and a half later or 2 months, you hope something shows up. And that's how we got our stuff, was all through Bullet Records. We'd buy everything.
What about that Holocaust EP with the ironing board?
Well, yeah. So, of course, about 2 months after we ordered the Holocaust EP and some other stuff, Lars calls up and says, hey, I got great news. The package is here. The Holocaust is here. I go, that's awesome. And he goes, but I got bad news. And I said, what? He goes, well, your copy got damaged.
No!
Yeah. I said, what do you mean? I said, Lars goes, yeah, your copy. I said, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean my copy? He goes, well, he goes, I took one out. And I was in the kitchen, and I set it on the stove. My mom turned the burner on, and it got warped. I said, so my copy got warped. So I drove all the way down. I drive all the way down to Newport Beach. So I end up with this warped copy, and I bring it home and I have my mom put it on an ironing board, and she ironed it flat just so I could listen to it. So anyhow, Lars had managed to damage my copy somehow. But,
He was good at that. He broke my tape deck, listening to the same Diamond Head tape over and over. That amazing one from London, 1980. He just kept playing it over and over and rewinding it and playing it over and over on my tape deck. What a madman.
I'm sure the tape didn't break. Your tape deck broke, but I'm sure the tape is fine.
Yeah. Yep.
Did he buy you a new one? Did he replace it?
No. He claimed his mom did it.
Yeah,
I'm joking.
All right, well, listen, I want to find out what was the first albums that turned you on to the new wave of British heavy metal. I remember the day that Def Leppard came out.
That's what I've heard. Get off the skull. We're taking you out of
I mentioned Def Leppard.
Exactly.
Hey, hold on. They were good. They played. They opened, was it Ted Nugent in May of 80?
Right.
And that was a good tour.
Right. Santa Monica
No, I saw that in L.A.
I agree 100%. I can't stand Def Leppard now, but they were probably the first album I bought. The first import I think I bought was Metal for Mothers, but prior to Metal for Mothers, I couldn't afford. I mean, imports were expensive for a kid back then, and this is before Oz Records and all that. I remember the domestic records that came out was Def Leppard, then the Saxon Wheels of Steel, of course, Motorhead's Ace of Spades, and remember, The Chase is Better Than the Catch opened up that album on the domestic version. And also, there was another band. It was probably about the same time I bought Def Leppard. They are never ever credited anywhere.
Who?
Well, you take a guess. Domestic record came out, I believe it was on RCA or Golden
Tigers?
A&M. Nope. Tigers was on MCA. That was another one, Wildcat. The
yep.
first except, the I'm a Rebel record was out on Gem Records.
JBC.
You talking about an English band?
British band. I never see them credited, and they were really the band, apart from Def Leppard, that introduced me to the new wave of British heavy metal. They were more hard rock than metal, but
Praying Mantis?
No, nobody knows of this band.
Tell us.
Wait.
Come on, Brian, you got.
Come on, Brian.
Kornerans, you got to know this.
I'm saying.
Come on, Kornerans. Come on, John.
Brian's got the whole new wave of British heavy metal collection. Come on, man.
I know. I have every single copy of everything, and I can't.
Are they on that compilation?
Okay, if you before Kerrang, Circus Magazine used to have blurbs about this band, Motorhead, and Saxon, and Iron Maiden, I think, too.
It's just 80 or 81.
This must have been 79, 80. When did Def Leppard On Through the Night come out? What was that year?
That's 80. That was 80. I don't know about
81 was On Through the Night, I think, right?
No, it had to be 80.
It came out after the first Iron Maiden, right?
It was the band Marseille. Remember Marseille? That was a domestic release.
Yeah, Red, White, and Blue. That's one of their albums, Red, White, and Tattooed or something.
I don't know. That was the first. And another band that was released domestically, who I think were hugely underrated, was the band More. They were on Atlantic Records. The first album, Warhead, and the second album,
but that's 1982, right?
Awesome. No, I think Warhead was either 80 or 81. Then Thunder, Blood and Thunder.
Yeah, More, because I think that there was something on that in the fans, because More was like, I remember More and Manowar came out around the same time. They're like two bands I'd never heard of. I'm like, who are these?
Manowar was 81 with the Orson Welles song, right?
Yep.
Dark Avenger.
I have a funny NWOBHM story. It's pre-NWOBHM. It's Motorhead. It's the very first Motorhead EP with what is that? City Kids.
Larry Wells. Yeah, Larry Whalen.
It's the but it was a 12-inch EP. And it was 45. I couldn't figure out if it was supposed to be played at 33 or 45. We said, this guy is the worst singer. It didn't sound any better at either speed. We couldn't figure out who is this hideous band.
That is funny. I thought it had Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers and Witch Doctor.
Oh, yeah.
With Bass Eddie Clark singing. It was that 4-song EP. You know the one I'm talking about?
The 4-song, yes.
It was a 12-inch, so I thought, okay, it's on 33. But it was actually supposed to be on 45.
It didn't sound any better either way.
The funny thing about Motorhead, I agree with that. The funny thing about Motorhead, though, is they weren't really part of the new wave of British heavy metal. They were not considered part of that.
They led it.
Came much earlier than that. And they were too big. They were like the biggest. I think for a while they were the biggest band in Europe. So they weren't really. technically a part of the new wave.
Yeah, but they were the band that pretty much ushered everything in. I mean, they were kind of really the groundbreakers. I mean, a lot of people go back and say Judas Priest, but Motorhead were truly, even though they
Don't tell Lemmy he's heavy metal, though. He will never admit to that.
Right.
Yeah.
He would say, we're more punk than metal. We're a hard rock band. So he will always be.
Maiden.
Maiden is quintessential metal, like the early Judas Priest album.
Yeah, but Rod Smallwood scolded me. I was talking to him at one of the 15 shows that I saw this last tour, and I said that something about Iron Maiden is the greatest metal band of all time, and Rod goes, "Excuse me, rock band." I'm like, whatever. Take your pick of genres.
I didn't know Small Pockets is still around. Is Small Pockets still on tour with them? Small Pockets. Hey, but we're the king, so we're going to decide for people what's metal and what's not tonight, right?
That's true.
Hey, Bob, it's Kornerans.
Well, Iron Maiden is definitely metal.
Go ahead, John.
Yes.
So anyhow, to answer your question, I don't remember domestic, but I remember the first thing I got, because I was totally in UFO, Scorpions, Judas Priest, Sabbath, Zeppelin type, but always on the search for any band that had two guitarists in it, and bass drums, vocals. And when I saw the Metal from Mothers, I think that was the first thing I ever got over at Moby Disc, and that was import. And then I just stumbled upon the very first Angel Witch single that they happened to have there, which was Angel Witch with Gorgon on the B side.
Right.
And I thought, this is really cool. And then Metal from Mothers, and I started putting connecting the dots. And I think after that it was the Iron Maiden album, which would have been, I think I got that like in, I don't know, I want to say like fall of '80. I think that's when it came out. And then right after that I met Lars, and that's one of our connections was the fact that I had the Angel Witch single, I had the Maiden, Metal from Others, and I also knew who Bow Wow was, and he was really impressed by that. So that's kind of how we all just started getting together. As far as domestic, I don't even remember. I used to always try to buy import because they always had an extra song or a B-side or something.
Yeah, like I said, the first thing I ever heard was my buddy sent me the Soundhouse tape on the end of a set, and then I'm trying to think after that. I definitely the first thing that I remember buying, and I remember vividly today, was the day I bought the first Iron Maiden record. And I think it was out domestic at that point, and it was definitely a Moby Disc. I remember coming home, putting on my turntable, putting it on and sitting at my kitchen table listening to it going, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
Exactly.
And I was a huge fan of music before then, but there was just something completely different about what that record was doing and what was happening. Just like, oh my God.
To echo one point when you guys are talking about punk and metal and all the bridges, you have to factor in Paul Di'Anno, because when he first joined the band, he had shaved head and he was more of a punk singer.
Yeah.
And he really, and his style really pushed the band along with Clive Burr. I think the Iron Maiden went downhill. I'm a Di'Anno, Clive Burr fan. When they got Nico McBrain, which is a 4/4 drummer, and Bruce is he's a great singer, but I like the early stuff just because it has so much more energy and attitude. And I think they kind of settled into a formula.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. Is the funny thing is now you look at Iron Maiden, how big they are, and everything with Bruce, and the piano stuff is kind of a foregone conclusion. But when I was working at the record store when that happened, and when Di'Anno left, people were up in arms. There were a lot of people like John that when Number of the Beast came out, they're like, oh no, I don't like this at all. I like Di'Anno way better, and Maiden's over. And
I was a huge Samson fan, and Shock Tech is one of the greatest hard rock metal records. Fantastic record.
Too.
And Samson were a huge band. Samson were actually bigger than Maiden. They were one of the biggest new wave of British heavy metal bands, from what I was told when Head On came out.
They weren't bigger than Maiden, but they were definitely very big. The funny thing, when I interviewed Bruce when they first came over, I interviewed him for like an hour, and it's 45 minutes all about Samson. Like 10 minutes about Maiden. It's awesome. I found that.
Well, the reason Number of the Beast is a great album, I'll tell you, there's three reasons. Number one, that album was basically written when Di'Anno was still in the band. And number two, Clive Burr was still on drums.
He could have sang those, though. There's no way he could have sang half those tracks.
Well, I disagree. I think he could have sang those. And number three is the band was still fresh and young, and they weren't toured to death. After that, they settled into their formula with, the fourth album was Peace of Mind, which was still a good album, but then it started becoming formula, and the energy started getting zapped out. And that just happens that these damn managers and labels just tour these guys to death, and they just run out of
I think it was more Steve Harris's progressive influence.
It might have been, that might have been too, but also Di'Anno. You can't write progressive with Di'Anno in mind. And I think.
Well, dude, some of the stuff on Killers was very progressive, but Di'Anno just added that punk edge to it. But you listen to some
and that gave it the energy.
Go back to Phantom of the Opera, and that's totally progressive too on the first album. I mean, look, Number of the Beast in my mind is the greatest heavy metal album of all time, with Killers being number 2. But what John makes a point of is that they kind of after that they kind of burned out. That's just every single band. I mean, it's very rare if you look over the band of any band's career where 3 or 4 albums in, that's about.
Thin Lizzy got better.
Thin Lizzy absolutely got better. There's a lot of bands that get better. I mean, even today, we have this band of Motorhead that's on their 7th record that's having the biggest record they've ever had.
But every album usually is worse than the previous. Is my general.
Well, generally 3 or 4 albums are the peak, and then bands kind of there's a little bit of a lull there. But
did Van Halen ever have a second good album? Do they count?
Actually, I think their first 3 were pretty equal. Second one I didn't care for as much, but anyway, that's off the topic. But
well, no, you have to kind of start with America, because American music was so bad in '79 and '80. Every band put out a live album and then put out a pop album, and by 1980,
right, since we're on America, let's talk about one band that kind of got lumped into the British scene because they made it big in British. They were at the first Castle Donington, Riot.
Y&T?
Well, Y&T too, being a Bay Area. But Riot, I mean, Fire Down Under, that came out, 81? That is like one of the greatest American rock metal records ever, I think. And that
came out in 70.
Well, it was recorded in
9.
No, Narita came out in 79.
It finally came out at 81.
And actually, I think Fire Down Under was recorded right after in 79, but
80.
It wasn't released until 81 because
you're right.
It was supposed
That's
to be
right.
on Capitol and then it ended up on Elektra. I mean, Brian probably could confirm that.
Well, yeah. The funny thing about Riot though was that they were. I mean, Y&T was a much bigger band over there because they toured there and they did a lot of touring there. In fact, when John and I were over there, I actually went to see Y&T at the Marquee Club there, which is insane.
Right.
It was completely sold out. It was awesome. But Riot only played over there a couple times. I think they were bigger, almost more because of the legendary status that they had, more so than them going over and doing a lot of dates, because they didn't really play a lot of shows over there. But they clearly those 2 bands, and probably
they did Donington though.
Probably three bands that came out around the same time that had a lot of success in England. I mean, look, we can kind of, if you want to graduate out from the bands that happened around the new wave of British heavy metal, certainly Unmerciful Fate is another band that came out around that same time, and it was a hugely influenced band, and there's all that stuff you mentioned, the French bands like Trust and Warning, and
Except from Germany, Anvil from Canada.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is back in the day there, that a lot of those bands, even though they were probably hugely influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal, didn't really know, because there wasn't the internet and all this immediacy back then. A lot of these bands were toiling around the same time as that scene was happening, not really knowing that it was happening. So it's kind of interesting that you have this worldwide phenomenon. You go to Loudness and Bow Wow in Japan, where all these bands in that time from the underground kind of came all over the world in the same time frame in the early 80s that caused this thing to be really big. And I think John and Ron and Bob will all back me up. I mean, none of us back then ever thought this thing would be 1/10 as big as it is now.
Exactly. I mean, we thought it would going to always be underground, and a lot of the bands have remained underground. I mean, why do you think some of the bands that made it? I mean, going back to what we were talking about how all the bands, of course, everyone wanted to conquer America from whatever the country that was. You can't blame them from wanting to sign with a deal and whatever. But out of the bands that we talked about, like Tigers, Samson, Saxon, Raven, all these bands that got American deals, then who do you think would have been, well, actually Samson never did, but who do you think would have, if they stuck to their guns, would have still been, say, like Iron Maiden today? Because it really pisses me off when people see the MTV videos or whatever. VH1 Classic does a thing on the new wave of British heavy metal, and they played Love Potion No. 9 or Diamond Head, the commercial songs, and they think, those bands aren't heavy. They don't get how influential these bands were, because their only taste of these bands were from either their videos or from their American released records. What bands do you think would have made a lot larger impact?
Diamond Head.
I agree there.
Problem with Diamond Head is I think it was Sean's mother started managing them, or they started believing all the hype, and so they were waiting for the best possible deal, and that's the biggest mistake you could have made. They should have just gotten their asses out there and toured. and just got the momentum going. Like, you know, Rod Smallwood got Maiden out there and toured, and Leopard toured. But Diamond Head were just waiting for the best possible deal. So when they finally got their deal in '81, I think it was MCA. Everybody else had kind of passed them by.
But you know that album Borrowed Time, they just reissued that actually, I think on MVD label, and they have a bunch of bonus tracks on there. But listening to that record and comparing that to Lightning to the Nations, I mean, the production on Borrowed Time is horrible. The drum, it's like they're trying to sound like Def Leppard, but it sounds so sterile. The vocals are way up, which, I mean, Sean Harris sounds great. But everything else is so polished, and
the thing about Diamond Head were good looking, and they could write songs, and they could play, and they sounded good. Saxon were ugly, you know. Raven were just too over the top. I mean, Raven wrote some kind of a few good songs, but I mean, you know,
the first two Raven records were amazing.
But here's the problem with Diamond Head, though, and I love Brian Tadler. He's a great guy. At this day, he's awesome. But those guys in that band were not smart guys at all.
No, they weren't.
And they weren't surrounded by anybody that was smart either. And you know, ultimately, it is a business. And if you don't have half a clue, I mean, look. You know, the bands that made it from there, you know, Maid and stuff, I mean, those guys are, you know, they're not dumb guys. They're smart people. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that Diamond has. They're young kids. They weren't very savvy. They're from the middle of nowhere. That's where a lot of these bands were. Holocaust is, you know, another band.
They're from up north,
Holocaust could have been huge.
Holocaust was from Scotland. They're Edinburgh.
Working class, middle of nowhere, you know, not smart people, and they weren't surrounded by smart people.
The English, the people, the writers, they were totally slagging them by the time they finally got to take off. Diamond Head especially, you know, they were an awesome band all the way around. They should have been bigger than Iron Maiden.
They should have been, because their songwriting was great. Two bands that absolutely never should have made it, but they got lucky and they had good management. There were people who put them together, and one of them was Motley Crue. Brian and I were there in the beginning watching these guys fall all over themselves, and these guys, you know, should have been half of them dead by now. And the other
worst band ever.
Yeah, and the luckiest band ever to make it is Guns N' Roses, because they put out
Poison,
1.5 good albums.
Guns N' Roses, that first Guns N' Roses record, I mean,
but again, one and a half good albums in 15, 20 years. But again, it's all because of management.
Yeah, but you compare it to someone like Poison, who was just absolute complete shit. You know, at least Guns N' Roses.
Well, they had
good
management, and they came along at the right time, and they had the good MTV look. But if Diamond had good management...
Whoa.
It's timing. It very much is timing.
Yeah, I mean, timing has to be there. The scene has to come to you. But just real quick on Guns N' Roses, like, I knew Axl really well back then, and I knew Slash pretty well, you know, after the record had come out. I unfortunately, like an idiot, never went to see them early on because I thought they were a glam band. But that's a whole other story. But those guys, back then, were smart guys. They weren't, you know, dumb hicks from the middle of nowhere. They were smart guys. So there's a little bit of that in there, too. I don't want to lump those guys in, Guns N' Roses, with bands like, you know, Poison, who were kind of dumb guys. That might be the luckiest band of all time. But anyway, that's a whole other story.
But anyway, this is something I wanted to touch on. I mean, I interviewed Brian Ross not too long ago, Blitzkrieg, another band that we haven't yet mentioned. Satan, of course. And this is something he said, which is kind of interesting. I mean, we're all from, you know, either L.A. or Ron's from San Francisco, and we all grew up with the local metal scene. And something I always wonder about the UK scene, how the club scene was back then. And bands weren't all from London. I mean, they're from Newcastle, from areas that were real hardcore, working class. I mean, these guys were tough fuckers. It wasn't like a glam L.A. kind of scene. And he said a lot of the shows, it was so competitive. I mean, if a band had a gig, another band would slash the band's tires to their truck so they couldn't make the gig, and they would go in there and take the band's place. And, you know, they would beat up their road crew at bars and stuff so the band wouldn't have a road crew. I mean, just shit like that. I mean, but I think that's what really made the metal scene. It was a survival of the fittest attitude, and that's what gave the bands an edge. And you don't have that kind of stuff today, and that's why I always say the new wave of British heavy metal was really the last real, not just metal, but rock and roll movement. I mean, it was like these bands had to do what they could do to survive just to do a gig.
Sure.
Plus, England was very poor at that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And well, the other thing that I think is still really, really cool, and why that whole scene existed, was it was completely independent too. There were, you know, back when this started, there were no major label signing bands. Every one of those bands all started with a self-financed single or a small, tiny independent record. probably 85% of them all financed their own first recordings and singles, and they were doing it for the love of the music, and not because they all felt that, you know, oh, we're going to get rich, we're going to get famous, or, you know, we want to get involved in this because of, you know, getting a bunch of chicks and stuff. Whereas a lot of the LA scene was that,
right.
And the new Everybody Show, well, it wasn't about that at all. It's about, like, we're so into the music, we'll do anything we can, we'll pay for our own recordings, and that's why it was such a real scene, because it really was about the music and not about any of the peripheral stuff.
True, absolutely.
Well, that's kind of how Metal Massacre. That's how Metal Massacre came about, because Brian and I went around recruiting bands, but the only way a band really made it on the record is if they provided their own recording, because we couldn't afford to pay for the recording. So even these other bands are out spending their money recording themselves. The only band that didn't do that was Metallica, because it was recorded in the garage there in Downey or Norwalk, wherever Ron's house was.
Hey, they could afford to have a Fostex cassette recorder that they recorded on.
Yeah, but then they threw it on the ground at the end of the song, so I guess it was but we still have.
And it wasn't even their Fostex; they borrowed it from somebody. I think it was Lloyd's Fostex.
Okay, and then
the funny thing, John had to pay $50 to get the transfer. You know, when Metallica played their first gigs out here, they only played, I think, 2 originals, and everything else were either Diamond Head, Spawn Blitzkrieg, or Sweet Savage. That was it. And the famous story was when they opened for Saxon, and the guy was playing on the.
That was me.
Tape.
That was me. I brought the tape.
Oh, you were playing it. That's right. Well,
yeah, I brought it. That was their third show at the Whiskey. And I brought a tape because I knew the sound guy, and I brought a tape of all the
show.
It was the second show. I don't remember with John. It was the second show. The first show was Radio City. Second show was Whiskey.
Was a Whiskey opening for Saxon.
Yeah, and I brought the new wave of British heavy metal tape I had made at home, and I gave it to the sound guy, and he was playing it over the house system prior to the Metallica going on, and about 2 songs in, all of a sudden I'm upstairs, and all of a sudden Lars comes running out from one of the dressing rooms, frantic, running around, looking around, and he sees me and runs over and he goes, "Is that your tape?" I said, yeah. He goes, "What's the next song?" And I think I said, "Let It Loose" by Savage. He goes, and his face turns white. He goes, "Oh shit, take that off, because we're playing that tonight." You know, so half the songs on the tape were songs that they were playing.
And nobody knew. Nobody, of course, heard of these bands.
James would just go, "This is a song called Let It Loose," and they'd go into it. They wouldn't say, "Oh, this is a song that by a band called Savage," you know, this is Let It Loose.
They never did, and the first, 10 gigs they played all featured all that stuff, and nobody knew that they were doing cover songs.
They didn't say they wrote it, though, did they?
No, they never said they wrote it, but they just said this was a song called The Prince. Yeah, they would say this was a song called The Prince. That's it. Yeah, nobody knew that the songs were by anybody else, so they would just kind of take credit for it.
And this was 1982.
Yeah, it was 82.
This was right at the end of the scene, so.
Well, it's just it's the same scenario like Jimmy Page taking credit for Dazed and Confused, or for A Whole Lot of Love. I mean, nobody knew that Willie Dixon wrote A Whole Lot of Love because this was 1970 or 69, and nobody knew that Jake Holmes wrote Dazed and Confused.
But also Jimmy Page never paid anybody for that stuff. But one cool thing I will say about Metallica, though, that they didn't have to do is when they put out that Garage
Days,
Garage Days thing, when they did all the cover songs, they paid full publishing on every song on there. I mean, that's a lot of money that they paid out.
No, they've always given the bands proper credit. Even the fact that they did that new wave of British heavy metal compilation that you put out, Brian.
Yeah.
They've always, Lars has always credited the bands that have influenced.
There's a great story by that. Like, we were trying to get all the rights to all those songs, which is a freaking nightmare from hell. So we wanted Holocaust. At this point, Holocaust was long gone. Nobody knew where they were or anything. So he basically got out the phone book for whatever local town they were from and started calling everybody named Mortimer in the entire phone book until he finally found some guy. He just called up, "Is this John Mortimer from Holocaust?" They go, "Who?" And he finally picked him up and goes "Yeah, that's me." And he's like, "Hey, we want you to."
Lars also called me and he says, "Hey, get out your Parallax record because I know you have it. What record company is it on, or who wrote the songs?" And I would go through my record collection and give them that kind of information.
That was one band I never got. I never got into that band. That singer just annoyed me. Yeah, I think I actually owned that record and I got rid of it. I mean, I'm an idiot. I sold my whole vinyl collection.
No.
I had all the neat singles. I had everything. I mean, this was back in the 90s I sold it. Yeah, I'm an idiot. All right.
A lot of people did that. Lars did the same thing.
I love those people.
Yeah. John Sternansky has had half of Lars' collection.
Did he sell his too?
I had the other half.
Good Good, Kornerans, good.
So, speaking of this, let's talk about some of the independent labels. Obviously, we all know Neat Records. There was Neat Records, Heavy Metal Records. Not only the singles, and that was a thing back then. I mean, just to have a single out, which people can't relate to today, just to have a 45 out was a huge thing. I mean, some of the Neat Records stuff is still to this day some of the most classic metal releases. Heavy Metal Records, some of the compilation records, obviously, that came out. We talked about Metal for Mothers. You had the New Electric Warriors. You had Brute Force. You had Lead Weight that Neat put out. What were some of the other? You
had Ebony Records put a lot out too.
Oh, that's right. The Friday.
Oh, those were mostly
show.
Awful though on Ebony. Some of those bands, except for Detroit or Merciful Fate, were pretty bad.
Witchfinder General, come on.
Savage.
Okay.
Was on, yeah.
Yeah, but they're heavy metal records band.
Yeah. But anyway, what about some of the singles? What are some of your favorites?
Sweet Savage. That was the first one.
I think
really
Sweet Savage. He's right. That's probably the best one.
Maybe should be one of the most valuable records besides the Soundhouse tapes, which I owned and unfortunately sold myself to pay rent at one time. I think Soundhouse tapes is probably it, though, right? What do you guys think?
Well,
yeah.
As far as the rarest one or the best one?
Yeah, of course, it's one of the best. But also, the very first Def Leppard on Bludgeon Riffarola was good too, though.
It does have Riding to the Sun and that's an awesome single.
Overture and Wasted, I think. Overture, Wasted, and Riding to the Sun.
Awesome
single. And if you wanted a Lucky 300, the very first 300 actually had picture cover with lyric sheet in it too.
Oh, they did? I didn't have one of those.
Yeah, what about the first Tiger single on Neat and the first Raven single? The first Venom, the first Blitzkrieg.
Jess Cox, one of the worst singers ever. Ugh, come on. You got to go John Devereaux.
James loved them.
Metallica wanted to hire Jess Cox in the band.
Yeah.
They weren't taking that.
John Devereaux was an awesome singer, but the guy couldn't write lyrics worth shit. You know what was great when they first got Devereaux and Sykes in the band?
The best one ever is Bad Times. Bad Times with Devereaux.
I was just going to say, the audition tapes, Bad Times and Don't Take
Bad
Nothing.
Times, man.
If they kept to that style, they would have been fucking huge. That was awesome.
Yeah.
I mean,
that was stripped down.
Well, those two songs were written when Jess Cox was in the band. In fact, on the Japanese imports of both Wildcat and Spellbound, they have all the bonus tracks.
That's the best thing.
Worst thing to happen to a good metal band is get a good singer.
Yeah. Pretty singer.
True? You get John Devereaux, you're going to write pop songs, you're going to end up with the Cage.
Well, he thought he was Robert Plant. Have you ever seen him live or seen their videos? The guy thought he was Robert Plant on stage.
Well, he was a theater guy. That's the problem. He's a theater guy.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, he's doing theater now. Yeah, he's a theater guy. That's the problem.
All right. What I think, I'll give my vote for the most underrated new wave of British heavy metal band. I still think to this day, two of the greatest rock metal albums.
Demon!
Legend!
You got it, Ron Quintana. The first Legend and Death in the Nursery.
Death in the Nursery.
Way ahead of their time. Production-wise, it was done so cheaply, but musically, as far as
there were some islands off of England and between England and France. They couldn't help it.
Jersey Island.
They couldn't help it. They were recording in a boat or something.
Pete Hayworth, a brilliant guitar player, lyricist, and that was 79 and 80, wasn't it? No, 80 and 81.
Yeah.
That's a band that probably, we talked earlier about, bands that we thought could have been really big bands, and Angel Witch was one too. I mean, that first Angel Witch record is still one of the most amazing albums of all time. And then
they could have been like Maiden. In fact, didn't Maiden open for Angel Witch when Maiden got signed? Wasn't that the
story? That was Angel. It was Angel Witch. Well, no, but when they used to play together in the clubs, it was Angel Witch. I heard
Iron
Maiden.
EMI came out to see Angel Witch, and Maiden blew them away, so they ended up signing Maiden instead. That was the story I had heard.
I still got to throw Holocaust in there. I think Holocaust is really, one of the underrated.
That's some good stuff, but they kind of seemed like they were all over the place a little bit. I mean, they had some
some of those riffs. The thing about Holocaust, that was on an independent record, Phoenix or whatever. The production was done so professionally, and I thought the singer Gary Lettuce, he sounded good in the studio. If you've seen some of the live footage, they were real rough.
If you listen closely to some of the live stuff, you can hear a lot of, I hate to say this, but plagiarism by Metallica. You listen to some of the rhythms and the rhythm structures and the strumming and stuff, and there's some real early, pre-Metallica stuff going on in some of their songwriting and some of their rhythms there. I mean, you gotta put aside the vocals, you gotta put aside the production, but if you're really focused on the guitars and some of the riffing in there and some of the rhythms, there's definitely some James Fast wrist going on right there.
Well, I mean, look, they were so heavily influenced by all that stuff. Another band we haven't talked about a lot that I also thought, was another band
Jaguar
potential that did much is Jaguar, yeah.
See, I guessed it. Those first singles, in fact, even Storm Child on the Metal for Mothers.
Trespass.
That's crazy.
I was very tongue-in-cheek about Demon, but that album, Night of the Demon, is awesome.
That's a good record.
What about the first Savage album? That was bitching.
Savage.
I don't know. I like the first two Witchfinder Generals. They're pretty awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, those are good tunes.
And Witchfind was also good,
I
too.
never liked Witchfind.
Give 'em hell.
I wasn't.
Give 'em hell. Sorry, I can't sing.
You know, one band we should talk about is Girl School. I mean, the first all-female, I consider the first all-female metal band. I mean, a lot of people might say the Runaways, but they weren't metal.
No.
Girl School was straight up first all-female metal band that never got the respect they deserved. Great band.
Yeah,
Well,
Girl School.
after they did the same thing that you guys are talking about. Their third album, you know, they got signed to America, and their third album, Screaming Blue Murder, they went commercial. And they got pretty.
Play Dirty. No, what's a Screaming Blue Murder? Which one's the third?
Right. Screaming Blue Murder was the third. There was Girl School, which is Demolition. The second one was Hit and Run. Hit and Run was
Demolition Boys.
Yeah. But the third album, when they got the new bass player Vicky Blue, and they got commercial, and they got the hair poofy, and they got the American company behind them, and they got soft. And
I'm going to throw out a band. I know Brian was a big fan of theirs, and I thought they were a band that were on the verge to make it. Starfighters, remember them? Steve Young, wasn't it Angus's cousin?
Wasn't that just because of AC/DC connection? No. I didn't think they got that popular.
No, they had the Alley Cat Blues. Was actually getting on the radio here in L.A. quite a bit. You know what? Tell me if I'm wrong. Was that? I remember seeing that was on Jive Records, and of course, as people know, Jive was like the Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys label. But I think that was one of the earliest Jive records.
Clive Davis's label.
Wow.
There's another band too that was pretty good. Tokyo Blade.
Tokyo Blade, another good band. Yeah, they were a little bit later though. I mean, toward the tail end of the new wave of British heavy metal.
82? And you know, there's another band that I don't know if you want to throw them into this scene or not. Is Grim Reaper.
The Reaper. I mean, on Metal for Mothers, that was such a heavy riff. That was pre-Steve Grimmett.
And they were kind of funny because they had some success too.
Yeah, they were on RCA. That album, first album, I think actually went gold, didn't it?
Well, yes. I was going to say See You in Hell, I think is gold.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Still the heaviest band out of all this would be Merciful Fate. I mean, those guys are just unbelievable.
Let's expand this a little bit in Europe, because you can't talk about the new wave of British heavy metal without touching on Merciful Fate from Denmark, except out of Germany. There were some great Dutch bands, of course, Bodine, Picture. A lot of great bands. The French bands we talked about, Ocean, Trust, a fucking amazing band. Warning.
Voix de Fay.
Voix de Fay.
Sortilege.
Yeah.
And the Warning record, Fire, still one of the greatest opening.
Oh, yeah.
Albums.
Yep.
What about Satan Satan's Jokers? Remember
They
them?
were kind of poppy. The greatest thing about Satan Jokers was I think it was either Metal Hammer or Metal Attack. They were all like on a toilet praying, and it was like the greatest promo picture. That's the only thing I remember about that band. Sorry.
That's enough.
We can't finish it without talking about the two of the greatest named bands, Ethel the Frog.
Yeah.
And Rusty Nut.
What about Split Beaver?
Split Beaver, they were on Heavy Metal Records.
Yeah.
They had
What
a
about
single.
the other band?
Speaking of Swedish band, EF band from they were one of the
EF
Awesome.
band,
Comprende. Demon's Eye.
Swedish Torch, by the way. Torch.
Oh, yeah, Torch.
Swedish band. Yeah, Torch was
Silver
good.
Mountain, Oz from Finland.
Yep.
Mr. Ingve, Rising Force.
Yeah, and
Another
even
good name
the
was-
first Europe album was classic. I mean, a lot of people.
What about Vardis? Remember Vardis?
Vardis.
What about Mithra?
Mithra was great. Death to Destiny.
Mithra. I love
Mithra.
That's a classic EP.
And what? Remember the label, the Guardian Records? Remember Guardian?
No.
Sacred
Song,
Alien,
every band
Hollow
sounded
Ground.
the same, no matter what band it was. They all sounded the same on
Well,
Guardian.
that was the thing. Well, I think with a lot of the labels like Ebony and Guardian, a lot of those bands did sound totally the same.
Well, it did because
Like Heavy Metal Records.
they all used the same guitars and drums, and they just plugged in. They just turned the things on and played their songs.
These were bands I weren't even aware of back in the day. Demon Pact, I had that single. Okay, I knew about Getty's Axe, Scareb, Prowler, Pally Gap, Mars, Chainsaw, Energy, Lone Wolf, Boulevard, Break House, Triarchy, China Doll,
Triarchy.
Boll Weevil. Tell me if you know of any of these bands.
Boll Weevil?
I had the bad single. Dealer, Bashful Alley. I remember Bashful Alley. After Dark, of course, Split Beaver, Warrior. There's 2 or 3 different Warriors out there. Witchfinder General, of course, were classic. Metal Mirror, No Quarter, Satanic Rites, Badger, Hollow Ground we talked about on Guardian,
Awesome.
Shock Treatment, Tora, Trader's Gate, Deny, Ricochet, that was an old classic.
Ricochet, awesome. Midas Light.
Goldsmith, Dawn Watcher.
Yep.
What about Urchin? Adrian Smith's old band?
I was going to say, don't forget Urchin. Urchin was the last thing that I had to complete my New Wave of British Heavy Metal collection.
The 45?
$150 for one of these 45s, yeah.
That was
wow.
She's a roller.
There's only like 20 of them made or something.
What about
who was the singer? Was that Gary Barton?
Like a sledgehammer.
Sledgehammer.
I forgot about Sledgehammer.
Sledgehammer was on Metal for Mothers, weren't they?
Yeah. And they had an album that was heavy. Well, kind of boogie-ish, too.
You know what? That was a cool band, though. Their demo was a lot cooler than their single, and they sounded like the English version of Van Halen. And you never hear about them. It was a band called Last Flight. Remember them?
Yeah,
Last Flight.
They were a good band, man. A little bit of a funky edge, but a really rocking band. That, a lot of the demos were so much better than some of the singles. I mean, we talk about Merciful Fate. Some of those demos were still, to this day, some of the fucking heaviest stuff you'll ever hear.
The original Merciful Fate demos, one of the greatest demos in the history of music. It's so unbelievably heavy.
Absolutely.
Remember, John and I were listening to that when we got in '82 to England. Somebody had given us a demo, and we had no money, and we're sitting in some horrible bed and breakfast for 2 days with no money.
It was raining, and we were listening. It was John Norum gave it to us.
Yeah,
remember John Norum? He gave it to us. Yeah.
Yep, we were listening to that over and over again.
John Norum from Europe?
Or was it John Oram? What was it, John?
Yeah, it wasn't John Norum. It was John something. I forget his last name, but he was a weird dude. He wasn't a musician. He was like a writer guy that I knew.
But he gave us the Merciful Fate, and it was awesome. He also had a demo. He had a demo of Fast as a Shark by Accept. It was the first time I ever heard Fast as a Shark.
He had the whole record. I'll never forget. We were in this boys' school. It was shut down, and we were listening to all this stuff. He was playing us, and I was like down the hall. I'd gone to the bathroom or something down the hallway. So I'm coming back down the hallway, walking, and all of a sudden it was like, "Hi, Dio, what the fuck is that?" And it just starts in, and I'm like, "Oh my god!"
Fast as a Shark, probably the first thrash metal song.
I think Exciter by Judas Priest predates that a couple years.
Yeah, but I would call that more speed metal, or it's not really thrash.
What would you call the first Accept record with the Chainsaw Lady? It's Motorhead meets Scorpions, because it's got twin guitars and it's fast and heavy. There's some songs on there that sound like Motorhead, but they're twin lead guitars. The harmonies are just amazing on that first Accept album from 1979. I think that definitely set a precedence there.
Free Me Now. Remember
Free Me Now.
Yep.
Lady Lou. It's an amazing record, that first record.
Sounds of War.
Yes. Oh, my God.
And that was 78, right? Because Breaker...
78, not 79, 78.
Yeah, 78. Yeah. Shit. What about the band Black Axe, the single Red Lights with Highway Rider? Red Lights.
That was good.
Was like a punk metal anthem.
Deep Machine?
Deep Machine never released anything, did they? Just a
I don't think they did. I saw them in 82 live, and Kevin Hayborn was playing with them, with the Angel Witch, and I thought they were better live, but they just never put out anything. Just another one of those millions of English bands that just didn't quite make it.
The demo was great, though. The demo, you actually sent me the demo. Well, what are some of your favorite of the underground bands of the new wave of British heavy metal, or European bands for that matter?
Well, Mithra, you mentioned that Mithra. I kind of forgot about that. I'm going to have to go listen to that. But
Death or
I
Destiny
love
EP?
Yeah, freaking amazing. So amazing. That's like, of the stuff that probably nobody's ever heard of, that would probably be at the top of my list.
Well, I was trading tapes and demos, and I snuck a peek in Lars's Green Pacer one day, and I saw this huge tape list with all these Thin Lizzies and Iron Maidens, and I was just like stunned. And this is about 1980, so I hadn't heard of Brian Slagel. But he had some bands on this list that I was like drooling over, and I kept asking Lars, "Hey, introduce me to this guy." and of course, Lars would be Mr. Go-Between. He would tell you about all these bands because he would borrow tapes from his friends and then trade them to his other friends and get their tapes, but not introduce the friends, just so he could be the middleman and get all the best stuff.
That's how it works.
So I remember demos like Triarchy, Kraken.
Kraken was Canadian, weren't they? Kraken?
They were Canadian, but they were from the same era. They were awesome, and it was just all we did was trade tapes because it was cheaper, and you could you could listen to more bands than trying to go to your record store. And so in 1980, 81, to get music, there was no internet. You had to trade with friends. You had to steal from friends. Or you had to find a way to hear these demos of all these bands from around the world. That's how I heard Bow Wow before I could find their albums.
Sure.
That's how, I think Brian and me and John, and you, Bob, we all traded tapes more than anything in 1980 probably.
That's all we did, yeah.
Or 81.
And was it the greatest time of day when the mail would come and you'd be waiting there?
Oh, the mailman was Santa. It was Christmas every day when I get a package from England, a cassette from Copenhagen, a cassette, oh my God, from LA, but there was tape traders all over, Florida, New York, Toronto, even up in Seattle, everywhere. It was amazing.
Absolutely. That's something that people can't relate to today. You waited and waited and waited by the mailbox.
It's like with instant gratification now with the internet, you can just listen to anything, anytime, anywhere. And it's like back then, that almost kind of made everything a little bit more sweeter when you had to wait for so long and something arriving. Oh my God, you rip it open and put it in. And if it was good, it was the greatest thing ever. And if it wasn't, I think everything was good anyway, just because you were waiting for it.
Not Silverwing. Lars kept telling me how good Silverwing was. When I got that was like one of the biggest disappointments. But there was lots of those, but you forget about them because there were so many good bands.
Something that John Sutherland mentioned, which is so true, especially with that era before internet and all that, or even before MTV, where it became more of a big international market, is back then the bands musically was so cultural. You could hear the difference. You talk about the British sound, you talk about the French sound. You listen to, like you say, Truz, Voix de Fée, Warning. All those bands had a certain ocean. Not just the fact that they sang in French, but they all had a certain sound. Same with the Dutch bands, Bodine, Picture, Vandenberg. They were real classy sounding. The German bands either sounded like Scorpions or Accept, Bullet, Trance, all those bands. And then, of course, you had the Australian bands. They all kind of had that AC/DC kind of vibe. Rose Tattoo, Angel City, Heaven. You had bands like, Bengal Tigers, Taipan that came out a little bit later. But each band grew up with their kind of roots. And they all had their certain identity.
Well, they're called the Angels. Get it right.
Yeah, that's the original, of course.
Yeah, I was a huge fan of theirs. What's interesting, though, when you talk about all those different bands, I was really heavily into Warning, Ocean, and Trust, the French stuff. And the one thing about those bands that I found interesting is the recording quality sounded so good.
Absolutely.
So all the newer British heavy metal stuff is great, but if you go back and listen to it now, a lot of the recordings is just absolute crap. And those French bands, for whatever reason, all those records sounded just amazing. It sounded like professional records.
That first Ocean record, Aristo, when that song opens, the guitar riffs, the drum mix, you're absolutely right. Warning, same thing.
Yeah, all of it was so highly well done. Back then, so many, even all the stuff in L.A. that, we were putting out was, just thrown together kind of. But they had a really good recording quality. It's the same thing with the Japanese, Loudness and Bow Wow and stuff as well. Yeah, there's so many bands from all over the world that were all kind of happening at the same time. It's really amazing.
Well, I remember getting Warning from Stardust when that album first came out. As you guys remember, Japanese imports on vinyl. It was like $25-$30.
Ooh,
and I had to save money for weeks, and I bought that record. I got that on CD now, and I just listened to that the other day, and I still think one of the best produced records. That album totally stands the test of time. Just such amazing sound quality, the musicianship, and even their earlier stuff. You listen to a Silver Lightning from Signal Fire. Just
get on our train.
Yeah.
Yep. They had some great songs.
And that was like 76 or something.
Yeah, they go way back.
Well, the first album was 75.
Loudness was more new wave of British heavy metal time frame, but yeah, Bow Wow was insane.
And they played the new album. They played the Reading Fest when I was there in '82, and they were just so good. They fit in so well, and they played the Marquee, and they were two of the better bands I saw that whole summer playing live. They were just kick ass. They were tight. Bow Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about Trespass? Remember them?
Yeah,
Trespass.
Great band. That Bright Lights EP.
Now, they were a really overlooked gem. Yeah. They were.
You know why? Because they were on Metal for Mothers 2, which totally sucked, and they were like one of the very few good bands on that. And so I think a lot of people overlooked them just because of that, including me.
Does anybody have Mother's Pride?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, of course.
Is there anything good on there?
No, I don't know.
You know, Trespass put a record out in the 90s, which I've got a CD out, which is actually pretty good. I can't remember the title. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Trespass, though, was pretty good.
Well, Trespass was great. The Sutcliffe Brothers, man. I mean, one of these days, Storm Child.
Yeah, they were like one of those bands that was kind of the hit band for the moment back then, you know.
They should have made it. They definitely had the songwriting abilities. They wrote they had a lot of good songs, actually. And they could, you know, they just were one of those unlucky bands.
They just didn't get stuff released.
And they were pretty early on, too. Well, another band that you had mentioned, Brian, was Praying Mantis, who even Steve Harris to this day will say was
Captured City.
Great song. They're a little bit more progressive, but you know they always said that they were the next band to make it out of the new wave of British heavy metal back in, say, you know, 80.
Yeah, their songs weren't that good. The reason they didn't make it is they didn't have. They had maybe one or two good songs. They weren't that good.
And then they put out full albums of like Bitches Sin that weren't really that great.
Well, that's the thing.
You know,
the singles were really, some of these bands were almost made to make singles, and I even put A to Z in that category. Like you say, the Treason single with No Fun After Midnight was great, but the whole record wasn't that great. And same with a lot of those bands. That Bitches Sin record was a piece of shit.
What was the A to Z?
Zero was like that.
What was it called?
Yeah.
The Witch of
Berkeley. You know, one other band
Witch of Berkeley?
we kind of glossed over. One other band we kind of glossed over real quickly that that we should probably spend a little bit of time on is Venom. Because they really were, like, you know, Bob said it in the beginning, might have been the most influential band from that time period, just because they, you know, almost spawned a whole subculture scene of metal. And that's a
starting with Slayer.
Exactly. And they were kind of, and, I mean, the whole death metal thing, you know, all those bands go back to Venom is really kind of the first, you know, kind of band that they really, the original black / death metal band was certainly Venom, and they could have been massive if they had done things the right way. They were definitely headed in that direction.
Well, if Mantis could play guitar, they would have been amazing.
Well, you're right. They didn't have the talent to
put together a band before they could play.
Kornerans was amazing. He was Conrad, the Neat Records engineer, right? So he had access, and he had the ability to put out a single that sounded like shit. Which was the funniest record of all time when it first came out.
Oh, but dude, when that first came out, I mean, didn't that scare the shit out of you? I mean, when you heard that record, it was like, what the fuck? I mean, I agree with Brian. I think Venom were almost as influential as, say, I mean, dare to say the Beatles. I mean, you look at any person that has a death metal or black metal or thrash metal T-shirt, they were either directly or indirectly influenced by Venom. Because Venom,
and it was the look too. It was the T-shirts. It was the whole concept.
It was the look. It was the album cover. It was the logo.
Yes.
Everything.
The lyrics, everything.
They came up with the phrase black metal, right?
True.
And they were the most over the top. Remember in '84 when they toured America? They couldn't even tour America. They had trouble even playing in New York, didn't they? Because their stage show was so huge and bombastic.
Well, they made the mistake that kind of Diamond Head did, is that they waited too long and they wanted to play out with this elaborate stage show instead of just building up a foundation and waiting and being patient. They just wanted to go out too big too soon, and they needed to.
They're trying to do world domination. You know, there's another band that I forgot that maybe a couple of years later, but somebody mentioned something about a review being bad. I remember the worst review I think I've ever seen of a band ever was for Hellhammer, when that first Hellhammer.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
I remember Frank said, this is the worst album ever. I go, I have to buy that record. And I bought it. It was amazing.
Wait a minute, again, I think they single-handedly invented speed metal. The first album and the second
album. Faster than the Speed of Light. That's on the second album, though. You're right. The first album.
Yeah.
Heart Attack.
I love Raven, but I don't know that I give them that much credit. I mean, they were a great band back then, but I don't know that they were the original speed metal.
Well, I'm saying, what was speedier before
that? Second album is really fast.
That second album is so unbelievably fast, and that was pre-thrash metal.
Yeah.
You know, probably the first true modern speed metal song has to be Fast as a Shark.
Well, I agree there. I think that, too.
Prior to that, the only songs that I can remember that had a fast double kick drum going all the way through the song would have been
Evil
Fireball by Deep Purple. But after that, I mean, there was nobody playing Fast as a Shark with just that heavy rhythm and just those double kicks all the way through. I mean, that was just like a pile driver song, top to bottom, with a great solo in between. Raven would stop and start a lot. I mean, they might have little bursts of speed, but then they'd slow down.
Yeah, well, that was the thing about
speed metal really kind of started. I mean, it really technically, I guess, started with Slayer and Metallica. Really, that was real speed metal. I mean, they certainly were influenced by Raven, but I like what John said is true. Like, I don't know that they had any songs that were just real thrash.
Raven was a lot, dare I say, happier sounding, but they were still very.
I agree.
Speedy
I totally agree with that. But
yeah.
I mean, they certainly have their place there.
Remember their drummer Wacko?
Wacko! Is that Robbo?
They call him Wacko. He had the football
drummer was
helmet
named
on,
Wacko.
Yeah, and
his
he
name
the
was
drum
Rob,
with his
though.
head.
Yeah, Rob Hunter.
Hunter, that's it.
You remind me of a funny story about Wacko. I was at the Maiden show at Madison Square Garden this last year. I was hanging out with Richard Christie, the guy from the Stern Show. Which, by the way, Bob, we got to figure out a good subject to get him and me and you and maybe somebody else on, because Richard's a huge metalhead. And
really?
He's hysterical. Yeah, he's a great guy too. Great guy. But it's funny. He's really good friends with Jim Florentine. And Florentine, is this massive metal guy. He said, "Oh, dude, you got to meet Florentine. He's a huge metal guy. He's a huge Metal Blade fan. All this, blah, blah, blah." I'm like, all right, cool. So we were out to dinner or something beforehand, and he texted Florentine. He said, "I have a surprise metal something or other that you're going to meet tonight." And Florentine texted him back. He goes, "Who, Wacko?" So I went up to him and said, "Hey, I'm Wacko."
What are some of your favorite albums? If I were to say your top 10 new wave of British heavy metal albums, you could throw in the European albums of that time as well. I know it's hard to say just off the cuff, but go ahead, John.
Oh, thanks. I get to go first.
Some of your favorites.
I'm glad I'm not first.
Well, the first two Iron Maiden albums.
Right.
Restless and Wild. God. I mean, Breaker really is up there, too. Merciful Fate didn't have an album until, 83? Would that count?
Rave-On Records, yeah.
None
on Rave-On.
82.
Yeah, that was late 82.
Yeah, okay, so definitely Merciful Fate. I mean, I do like the Spellbound album by Tigers a lot. I like the first Def Leppard a lot. Wow. I mean, Saxon, if you could take songs from the second and third album and make one album, I'd probably throw that in the mix. Trespass never had an album. You can't count a compilation album. Angel Witch is a real good one. Yeah, that's a pretty strong album out of the gate. Boy. God, who else is there? I mean, Ocean was kind of weak. I mean, they had one or two songs, or three or four. Satan Jokers, Void of Fate, I think that album was decent. The first Savage album I kind of like. I'm just talking off the top of my head now. Brian,
how many
your
is
turn.
that? Thanks. Did you get 10? See, you took a lot of my stuff. Let's see. I'll try to do a top 10 for you off the top of my head. Number one is is Number of the Beast counted as in the scene for New Wave British?
Yeah,
sure. That's 82.
All right, so Number of the Beast will be 1, Killers will be 2, the first Iron Maiden album will be 3. So there's 3.
Let me throw Number of the Beast in too, because I do like that album.
Then Restless and Wild by Accept. Then Wheels of Steel by Strong Arm of the Law by Saxon. It's my favorite Saxon album. Let's see, that's 5. Now it's going to get difficult. I would say, the Mithra EP, which I forgot about until now, but I love.
Great.
That's 6. I'm going to keep to the last 4 being from the new wave of British metal scene. Let me think. I'm definitely going to say the first Jaguar record, Power Games. Amazing. Yeah. That's 7, so I've got 3 more. And I'm going to forget something really good, I'm sure.
Don't forget Split Beaver.
Hounds of Hell.
I'm gonna put the Savage single that had Killing Time on it, just because Killing Time, might have been the best song in that whole era, maybe.
1981, yeah.
I Have the Storm.
And then the Holocaust with the Holocaust EP that has the live Get Their Glory version on there.
Yeah.
Where at the beginning, stuck on this. That's so freaking heavy.
Raw Loud.
That's 9. 9 when I need one more. Let me think.
What about Merciful Fate?
I have Merciful Fate in there.
Wait, does that count?
Yeah. Sure. I'll put. I'm gonna have to put one non-English band there. The Warning album, the red cover, just called Warning, because
that's pretty good.
That's the best one.
Fire.
Yeah.
All right, Ron. What about you?
All right, Ron. It's up to you.
I think we're all in total disagreement. What is the third Saxon album with 20,000 Feet? Is that Strong Arm of the Law?
Strong Arm of the Law.
That's Strong Arm of the Law. Yeah, that's Strong.
Okay, that's around number 5. Because I'll put Killers first. I think that's still my number one favorite NWOBHM album by Maiden. And then their first album, the first Diamond Head, then Borrowed Time, the first 2 Legends, the first 2 Venoms for different reasons, Angel Witch, and maybe Holocaust. That's probably more than 10, but it's hard to differentiate between.
Angel Witch has to be in there.
I got Angel Witch in there.
Tactic too.
See, wasn't as much into Samson as much. Musically, they just never got to me. Samson. Thundersticks was a funny drummer. Bruce was a good singer.
Bruce.
Yes, Bruce.
And
Paul Samson was a good guitarist.
He
but
was awesome.
Musically, they never came together for me. Like Tiger or Blitzkrieg or Raven or Jaguar.
Hey, Ron, name your favorite Angel Witch song.
Gorgon.
I got Extermination Day. Remember that song?
That is a good one. What about
no, Hades Paradise. I changed my mind.
Okay. And then, they had a lot of songs that were just like on EPs and shit.
Well, Extermination Day was on that compilation that the BBC put out with
exactly.
Sweet
That's my favorite song. That thing's
Friday
badass.
Show, I believe.
Well, like one of the best Raven songs, Inquisitor, is on Leadweight.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. There was a BBC comp with Eye of the Storm by Sweet Savage.
Exactly. Eye of the Storm is awesome.
I mean, and of course the Metal from Others, and of course, a lot of those comps only had one-off songs that you couldn't get anywhere else.
Hey, what about the Inquisitor with a special guest Udo? Who can outscream who can outscream who? Man, that is awesome. I mean, that was
and they also
falls out.
Be Wild on the A side.
Can those guys talk anymore? Their voices must be so shredded. How's with John's? I missed him, John Gallagher, when he sang this time around.
Dude, they both sound great. Even last time I saw Accept was years ago, but I've heard live recordings, and Udo still sounds great, and same with John Gallagher.
Wow.
Really?
Udo sounds good. I saw Udo with Accept maybe 2 or 3 years ago at Vakken at one of those gigantic festivals, and they were actually really good. I was kind of surprised.
Accept always good guys. As far as my top 10, I think you guys touched on all of them. I would definitely say, I got to say Motorhead Ace of Spades. I mean, one of my top 5 favorite albums. Diamond Head, definitely. Lightning to the Nations. Holocaust, The Nightcomers. Samson, Shock Tactics. Love that album. I think that's such a classy record. The first Angel Witch.
Leave something out of it. Yeah, Diamond Head, Lightning to the Nations. I'm sorry. I got to put that in and take something else out. Yeah,
no, you can't, dude. It's too late. You fucked up, bro. Sorry, no taking anything
Top
back.
20. Top 20.
All right, Tank, you guys neglected to say. That would probably be in my top 10.
Tank.
Legend, for sure. I would have to tie the first album and Death in the Nursery. I like them equally. I would probably say the first Trust album, even more so than Ocean or any other French bands. Lee Elite, one of my favorite leads ever in that song.
Oh, yeah.
Break. And maybe I would say Raven. I don't know how many I have left, but probably Raven, first album. Tiger, Spellbound, and Saxon. I would actually say Wheels of Steel over Strong Arm.
Yeah, all good stuff.
Hey, do you guys know if all that BBC Live stuff, like with Sweet Savage, Eye of the Storm, is that available? Did that ever get released on CD?
I think there's a legitimate. I know there's a couple of really great. There's actually a whole great bootleg line. There's like 10 CDs of new wave British heavy metal stuff. It has a lot of the singles and a lot of the BBC stuff. But I do recall, and I think it's legitimate. Maybe I'm wrong, but I could have swore I saw some sort of a legit new wave British heavy metal thing from the BBC that had like Tigers and some of the a little more obscure stuff.
Hey, I gotta ask a question, Bob. Greatest live new wave of British heavy metal performance? I've got one.
That on recording or that we actually saw?
Either or, but I've got one on recording that I think is the greatest ever. That would be August 1980, Iron Maiden Reading Festival. Dennis Stratton on guitar, Paul Di'Anno vocals, Clive Burr, Dave Murray, Steve Harris. 4 songs. They came out of the gates. They open up with Prowler, which is the greatest song ever. They play like they're all on cocaine. They fucking rip and kick ass, and they're on fire, and their feedback is everywhere, and they can't stop. Also, I think it's the first time they ever played Killers live too, because they screwed up in the beginning. It's great. But that to me is probably the greatest.
Lyrics on Killers, right?
Yeah, I think it's slightly different lyrics, but to me that's in that metal box set that Brian was mentioning. To me, that's my favorite new wave of British heavy metal live performance.
You know what was a great live tape I got from, I believe, Stefan Royakers. I don't know if that's how you say his name, from Aardschok. The Merciful Fate live in Eindhoven. I'm sure you guys got that same tape back in the day. I used to listen to that.
I was there. It was awesome.
Were you at that show?
You were there?
Yeah,
Ron?
I was the Eindhoven. That's when they were signing doing the Rave-On record signing, and they were all
absolutely.
And I met King, and Eindhoven was pretty small, but they played a church next to a church the day before in this really even smaller place. That Eindhoven show is kind of on video. There's clips of that, I think, around, too.
It's black and white.
Black and white, totally.
I'll give a little plug here. We're actually, King's working on our Merciful Fate DVD, and it's going to have a lot of that old stuff on it. And he's also got a King Diamond DVD that's got like a 6-camera show from 89 or 87 or something. But yeah, there's a Merciful Fate DVD. I'm hoping it's gonna be out before the end of the year, but it's gonna have a lot of that old stuff on it. So
good,
because he's got all of it.
Did he have the mic stand back then out of the bones he took out of the graveyard?
He used to walk around.
He does on the video.
The funniest thing ever is the Metallica Guitar Hero thing that's coming out. King's in it, and I was actually at King's house a couple of weeks ago, which was always awesome, but it was really awesome because we had a gigantic tornado warning, so there's sirens going off, and we're like,
this is Texas?
Texas, right?
Yeah, in Texas. But he showed me the like a little preview of the King Diamond character in Guitar Hero. It's so freaking amazing. They did a great job. They got the whole thing with the cross and everything. It looks incredible.
All Metallica songs?
Yeah, they do. It's all Metallica songs, but they also have a bunch of other stuff in it. Like they've got Sam Hain and it's a bunch of other stuff. There's 2 Merciful Fate songs.
There's even Thin Lizzy on there, right?
I think so.
Whiskey in the Jar
is on there. There's a bunch of stuff. But yeah, there's 2 Merciful Fate songs, Evil and Curse of the Pharaohs. And they couldn't find the original tapes, so the original band, except for Kim Russ, a different drummer, went back in and re-recorded it. It sounds amazing. I'm not a big Guitar Hero guy, so I can't tell you like how it all works, but I think I might have to learn to play it just so I can be King Diamond.
But before we go, Brian, I want to mention, obviously, Metal Blade, you've been very, very supportive of the new wave of British heavy metal. You reissued some of the CDs we talked about. Jaguar's Power Games, an absolute classic. The Quartz record, Sweet Savage. You put out that record, right, which combines some of the BBC stuff?
We did Sweet Savage, we did Holocaust.
Night
Obviously, we did the whole new wave of British heavy metal compilation that Lars did.
Diamond Head, Lightning to the Nations, long ago you did, right?
Yep. Yeah, all the Diamond Head stuff. I mean, most of it's kind of still semi in print or kind of out of print, but over the years we've reissued, I think, about 25 of all the classic stuff. So it was fun.
It's Kornerans. You got to save me a Sweet Savage. I didn't know you had one of those. I got to come out there.
I mean, unfortunately, it didn't all sell nearly as well as I hoped it was all going to sell because, I'm such a big fan, but you just kind of forget that, not that many people really.
Not many people know
about it. So, we had a lot of extra copies of a lot of that stuff.
For anyone listening, could they order through you got through the Metal Blade catalog, or is there a website they could go to and order some of this stuff?
Yeah, I don't know that we have to. I don't know that we honestly have a whole lot of that stuff left. I mean, you go to the Metal Blade store on metalblade.com and see if there's anything left, but there's not a whole lot of that stuff that's left, unfortunately. But we still have some of it lying around. So.
All right, guys. Well, any closing words? You guys want to give out any websites or anything you want to give out before we end this?
Metalblade.com. There you go, Brian.
Thank you.
I'm throwing all my Metal Manias together for a book soon, so I finally found some of my originals.
Hey, I still got a lot of them if you need them.
Put them on eBay.
Yeah, let me know when you're going to do that. They keep bugging me to do the same thing with my...
When is New Heavy Metal Review going to do it?
You should, dude.
Yeah, well, people have been bugging me for like the last 5 years, and I have all of it. I just never got around to putting...
What number did you get to?
I only did it for a year, so I think I only got to like 11.
We only did like 7 or 8 of them. Yeah.
You got 11?
I think we did 10, maybe. How many did you do, Ron? You did a lot.
I think the last issue was the Cliff issue in 22. Wow. After that, I went video and went to art writing for Art Shock America. Of course, you saw where that went.
Well, there you have it. The great new wave of European heavy metal podcasts that featured the great Brian Slagel, Ron Quintana, and John Kornarens.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.